The sun had not yet fully risen when the screams echoed through the valley. On that harsh winter morning in Arizona in 1832, frost covered the ground like a white, silent blanket, indifferent to the human despair unfolding beneath its gray sky. Aurora woke up to a sound that no child should ever hear, the sound of wood breaking, harsh male voices, and then her mother's screams. The girl curled up under the thin blanket, trembling, not only from the cold that seeped through the cracks in the makeshift hut, but from the terror that froze her little heart. When silence finally came, it was even more frightening than the chaos. Aurora waited, counting to 100 as her mother had taught her, and only then did she come out of hiding. What she found would mark her soul forever. Fernanda was lying on the dirt floor, her face disfigured by bruises that were already beginning to swell. Blood flowed from a deep cut on her forehead, forming a dark pool around her. Her eyes were closed, and only a weak, irregular breathing showed that there was still life in that broken body. The girl fell to her knees beside her mother, her small hands trembling, not knowing where to touch her without causing more pain. Hot tears ran down her face as she whispered Fernanda's name repeatedly, as if that word had the power to bring back the strong woman who had always protected her. But Fernanda did not wake up, and Aurora, even though she was only 6 years old, understood with terrifying clarity that her mother was dying. The hut was destroyed. The few belongings they had been ransacked, broken, or stolen. The men who had done this were cruel outsiders who roamed the territory, taking advantage of those who were alone and vulnerable. Two unprotected women were easy targets in that lawless land. Aurora looked around, searching for help that did not exist. The nearest cabin was miles away. There was no doctor in the area, only a healer who rarely showed up. And even if there had been, how could a small child pay for his services? Then she remembered the farm, Mr. Williams' large farm, which lay beyond the hills, where they said a huge and frightening man lived, whom no one dared to contradict. Her mother had always warned her never to go near that place, never to attract that man's attention. But now, looking at Fernanda's pale face, Aurora saw no other choice. With quick, clumsy movements, the girl grabbed an old blanket and carefully covered her mother, trying to keep her warm. She placed water within her mother's reach in case she woke up, and then, without shoes suitable for the journey that awaited her, Aurora ran out onto the frozen plain. Her small feet broke the thin layer of ice that covered the ground. The cold cut through her skin, through her worn orange dress, the only one she owned. Her lungs burned with the icy air she breathed with every desperate step. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The distance between her cabin and Williams' farm seemed endless for such small legs. Aurora stumbled several times, scraping her knees on the rocks, but she got up immediately and kept running. In her childish mind, every second lost was 1 second less of life for her mother. The sun appeared on the horizon, tinging the sky with shades of orange and pink, a cruel beauty in the face of the tragedy that was unfolding. The morning light revealed the immensity of the farm in the distance, sturdy corrals, an imposing barn, and the main house, large and solid as a fortress. When Aurora finally reached the edge of the property, her strength was almost exhausted. Her feet were bleeding, leaving small red marks in the frost. Her breath came out in short, gasping clouds, but she continued through the wooden gate that creaked under her touch. That's when she saw him. William was near the barn, axe in hand, shirtless despite the intense cold. His figure was colossal. Muscles defined by years of hard work glistened with morning sweat. His dark hair fell over his eyes, and a thick beard covered his face marked by scars that told stories of violence and survival. He was everything people said: intimidating, brutal, a man who solved problems with his fists, a man everyone feared and no one dared to challenge, a man without family, without friends, who had chosen to live isolated on his farm, far from the rest of humanity. Aurora stopped a few feet away from him, her small body shaking violently. For a moment, fear almost made her retreat. But then the image of her bloodied mother came back to her mind, and she found strength she didn't know she had. William looked up and saw her. For a brief moment, something that could be surprise crossed his stern face. Children didn't appear on his property. No one appeared unless it was absolutely necessary. The girl took a few more faltering steps toward him. Her legs finally gave way, and she fell to her knees on the cold earth. With the last remnants of voice she had left, Aurora lifted her face, dirty with tears and dust, to that frightening giant. And then, with a heartbreaking mixture of despair and hope, she uttered the words that would change everything. The girl's words echoed in the silence of the frosty morning. William stood motionless, the axe still in his calloused hands, watching the fragile, bloodied creature kneeling before him. His eyes scanned the girl's bruised feet, her torn dress, her face covered in tears and dirt. For a moment that seemed like an eternity, he said nothing, did nothing, just stared at that girl as if she were an inconvenient problem that had appeared on his property. William's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile, but an expression of cold, calculated disdain. He dropped the axe to the ground with a dull thud and crossed his arms over his broad chest. The farmer's attitude was clear. He didn't care. In that brutal land, everyone looked out for themselves. Compassion was a weakness that few could afford to have. Aurora felt her heart break at that reaction. Her last hope seemed to slip away like sand through her fingers. She had run so far, endured so much pain, only to find indifference in that man's eyes. More tears streamed down her face, but now they were tears of deep and devastating despair. Yet the girl did not get up, did not run away. Something inside her, perhaps the impossible love for her mother, perhaps childish stubbornness, which did not yet know the word give up, kept her there. Aurora stretched out her small, dirty hands toward William in a gesture of supplication so pure and desperate that it seemed to tear the very air around her. William looked away, turned his back, as if he simply wanted to go back to his work and forget that this child existed. There was no room for sentimentality in that world. He had learned this the hard way in a life marked by betrayals and losses that had turned him into the closed man he was now. But then Aurora did something unexpected. With a broken and weak voice, she began to talk about her mother. There were no dramatic cries or pleas. They were just simple words from a child describing the woman she loved. How Fernanda sang to her to sleep on cold nights. How she shared the little bread they had, always giving most of it to her daughter. How she worked until her hands bled to make sure Aurora had something to eat. The girl's words were interrupted by sobs, but they carried a truth so raw and genuine that it was impossible to ignore. She wasn't asking for a stranger. She was asking for the person who was her whole world, the only family she had in that merciless vastness. William felt something strange in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, maybe decades. It was uncomfortable, unwanted. He clenched his fists, trying to suppress the weakness that threatened to emerge. But the more he tried to ignore it, the more the child's words penetrated the defenses he had built around his heart. He turned again, and this time really looked at Aurora, not with disdain or indifference, but with something deeper. He saw a child who had walked miles barefoot in the freezing cold. He saw courage where there should have been only fear. He saw a love so immense that it defied death itself. And William saw something else. He saw himself many years ago, a younger, more vulnerable version of himself who had also lost someone dear because no one cared enough to help. The old, painful memory, buried under layers of anger and resentment. But now, in front of that girl, it resurfaced with devastating force. Something changed in his face. The stiffness gave way to a softer expression, almost imperceptible, but real. William took a few steps toward Aurora and for the first time bent down to her height. His stern eyes met the child's frightened eyes. Without saying a word, he picked her up with a gentleness surprising for a man of his size. Aurora, exhausted and relieved, did not resist. William carried her to the barn, where he took a horse that was already saddled and placed her in front. He mounted behind her, holding her secure with one arm while holding the reins with the other. The horse galloped toward Fernanda's cabin. William asked no questions, demanded no explanations, simply acted on something he himself did not fully understand. Perhaps it was redemption. Perhaps it was a chance to do what no one had done for him in the past. The journey that had taken Aurora so long to walk was completed in minutes by the fast horse. When they reached the destroyed cabin, William quickly dismounted and went inside. What he saw made him clench his jaw tightly. Fernanda was even paler than when Aurora had left her. Her breathing was almost imperceptible, and the blood formed a larger pool around her. William knew how to recognize the proximity of death. He had seen enough of it in his life to know when someone was on the threshold, but he also knew that there was still a chance, however small. Without hesitation, William tore pieces of his own shirt to staunch the bleeding. He worked with an efficiency born of experience, treating the most serious injuries first. His large, rough hands moved with unexpected delicacy, as if they knew exactly what to do. Aurora watched closely with wide eyes, following every movement of the man who moments ago had seemed to be her sentence of despair, but who was now her only hope. She saw something that no one else saw. Behind that brutal facade was someone who still cared. When William finished stabilizing Fernanda, he carefully wrapped her in blankets and picked her up in his arms as if she were as fragile as porcelain. Without saying a word, he nodded to Aurora to follow him. He would take Fernanda to his farm, where he had medical supplies and better conditions to care for her. As they rode back, Aurora held on to the saddle behind William, looking at her mother's unconscious body, which he carried so carefully. And for the first time since that terrible morning, the girl felt something other than despair. She felt hope. The scary giant that everyone feared had proven to be much more than he appeared. And at that moment, under the midday sun that finally warmed the frozen earth, three lives intertwined in a way that none of them had ever imagined possible. William's house was large, but empty of any warmth that would make it a real home. The solid wooden walls held the silence of years of loneliness. There were no decorations, only what was necessary for the survival of a man who had chosen to live apart from the world. He took Fernanda to his own room, the only one with a decent bed, and laid her on the clean sheets with a care that contrasted sharply with his intimidating appearance. Aurora followed his every step, a small, silent shadow who dared not stray more than a meter from her mother. William worked on Fernanda for hours, cleaning her wounds, applying ointments he had learned to make from desert herbs, and bandaging the most serious areas. His hands, accustomed to violence and hard work, moved with almost medical precision. He had learned those skills out of necessity at a time when there was no one to care for him when he returned injured from inevitable confrontations. The girl watched everything in silence, sitting in the corner of the room, hugging her own knees. Her eyes, red from crying, were now fixed on her mother's face, looking for any sign of improvement. Time passed slowly, marked only by Fernanda's weak breathing and William's occasional movements. When he was finally done, the farmer stepped back and observed his work. Fernanda was still unconscious, but her breathing had become more regular, stronger. The bleeding was under control. She had a chance, albeit a small one, but the next few hours would be decisive. William left the room without saying anything, leaving Aurora alone with her mother. He needed air, distance from that situation that stirred up feelings he preferred to keep buried. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall and closed his eyes, trying to understand why he had gotten involved. Why hadn't he just ignored that child and gone back to his work? But deep down, he knew there was something about that girl, that unwavering love for her mother, that had awakened memories he had spent years trying to forget. Memories of his own mother, who had died when he was young because no one had helped her. Memories of the pain and anger that had shaped the man he had become. Hours passed. Night fell on the farm, bringing with it an even more intense cold. William lit the fireplace and prepared something warm to eat, but Aurora refused. The girl did not leave her mother's side, her small hand holding Fernanda's cold hand, as if that touch could keep her anchored to the world of the living. William watched from the doorway, a bowl of steaming soup in his hands. He saw the child's dedication, her refusal to give up, to let fatigue or hunger distract her from her vigil. It was a loyalty he hadn't seen in a long time, a purity of feeling that the world around him had taught him to consider weakness. But there was no weakness there, just a different kind of strength, one he no longer possessed. He entered the room quietly, and placed the bowl next to Aurora. The girl looked at him with tired eyes, and something passed between them. It wasn't words, but an understanding. William nodded slightly, and Aurora, finally acknowledging her own exhaustion, took a few sips of the hot soup. The farmer sat in a chair on the other side of the bed, too big for that simple piece of furniture. He didn't know why he was there. He should be taking care of the farm, the animals, the thousand tasks that always demanded his attention. But something kept him in that room, in that silent vigil, next to two strangers who had entered his life a few hours ago. The night wore on. Aurora, unable to resist her extreme fatigue, ended up falling asleep while still sitting, her head resting on the edge of the bed, close to her mother's hand. Even in her sleep, her face wore a worried expression, small wrinkles of tension that should not exist in such a young child. William watched her sleep, and something inside him stirred. He got up carefully, took a blanket, and placed it over the girl's shoulders, protecting her from the cold that penetrated through the cracks in the windows. Aurora murmured something unintelligible in her sleep, but did not wake up. He returned to his chair and remained there, an unlikely guardian of that fragile scene. His eyes alternated between Fernanda and Aurora, two lives that were now, somehow, his responsibility. It was a strange, uncomfortable feeling. For years, he had taken care of only himself, refusing any connection that might make him vulnerable again. But now, looking at that girl sleeping next to her dying mother, William realized it was already too late. He was already involved, he already cared, even if he tried to deny it. In the darkest hours of the night, when even the sounds of the farm fell silent, Fernanda finally stirred. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but William noticed it immediately. He leaned forward, watching intently as the woman's eyelids fluttered, struggling to open. Fernanda's eyes finally opened, confused and unfocused. She tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. William quickly grabbed a glass of water and, with extraordinary care, helped her take small sips. The confusion in Fernanda's eyes was understandable. She didn't know where she was, who this huge man caring for her was, or how she had gotten there. Her last memories were of pain, violence, darkness closing in around her. William said nothing, just gestured toward the other side of the bed. Fernanda turned her head with difficulty and saw Aurora, her little Aurora, sleeping peacefully, safe and alive. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Tears of relief, of gratitude, of a maternal love that surpassed even the physical pain that still consumed her. She tried to move her hand to touch her daughter, and William helped her, carefully guiding Fernanda's injured arm until her fingers could caress Aurora's tousled hair. The touch was enough to wake the girl. Aurora slowly opened her eyes and for a moment was disoriented. Then she saw her mother awake, conscious, alive. The cry of joy that escaped her lips echoed through the silent house, a sound so pure with happiness that even William felt a tightness in his chest. The girl threw herself carefully into her mother's arms, sobbing with relief. Fernanda hugged her with what little strength she had, whispering words of love and comfort, promising that they would never be separated again, that everything would be all right. William watched the reunion in silence, a lone witness to that moment of pure love. He should have felt like an intruder, but he didn't. Somehow, being there, having helped make that moment possible, gave him a purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Fernanda finally turned her eyes to William, and in that look there was a gratitude so deep that words were unnecessary. She didn't know who he was or why he had helped, but she understood that she owed him her life, and not just her life, but the life of her daughter, who could have died of cold and despair if that man hadn't responded to her cry for help. The farmer nodded slightly, uncomfortable with that gratitude. He was no hero, no savior, just a man who had done what needed to be done, nothing more. But as he looked at the two of them hugging on the bed, alive and together, William knew he was lying to himself. He had done much more than was necessary. He had opened a door in his heart that he thought was locked forever. And now, for the first time in decades, that huge empty house didn't seem as cold as before. The days that followed brought a strange routine to William's lonely farm. Fernanda was recovering slowly, still weak and in pain, but improving every day under the farmer's meticulous care. Aurora had become a little shadow that followed William everywhere when she wasn't at her mother's side, observing everything with those curious eyes that seemed to see beyond the hard facade he maintained. William wasn't used to the presence of other people. His life had been built on deliberate solitude, on the comfortable silence of someone who doesn't need to explain himself or expose himself to anyone. But now there were voices in his house. There was life where before there had only been emptiness. At first, he kept his distance. He took care of Fernanda when necessary. He made sure Aurora ate and was warm, but he avoided conversation. He avoided anything that might create deeper bonds. They were temporary guests, nothing more. Soon they would be recovered and go their own ways. But Aurora had other plans. The girl, with that innocent persistence of children, did not accept William's silence as rejection. She followed him to the barn in the morning, watched him feed the horses, repair the corrals, work the hard earth. And even when he didn't speak, Aurora spoke for both of them, telling stories about her life with her mother, about small dreams and big hopes. At first, William only grumbled monosyllabic answers when he responded, but gradually, almost without realizing it, he began to really listen. He began to recognize in Aurora's stories a resilience that mirrored his own, an ability to find beauty in a difficult life, to maintain hope when all seemed lost. One afternoon, while repairing a broken fence, Aurora asked him why he lived alone. The question was simple, direct, the way only children can ask. William was silent for a long moment, his hands pausing in their work. He could have ignored her. He could have sent the girl away. But something in the way she looked at him, without judgment, just genuine curiosity, made him answer. He didn't tell her everything, but he shared fragments of a story of loss and disappointment, of how he had learned that depending on others meant opening himself up to betrayal and pain. Aurora listened with a seriousness that contrasted with her age. When he finished, she simply said that not all people were bad and that he had proven that by helping them. The words were simple, but they carried a truth that William couldn't deny. That night, for the first time in years, William had dinner at the table with company. Fernanda, still weak but able to sit up, had insisted on preparing something with the supplies he had. It was a simple meal, but there was something about sharing food, about being together, that transformed everything. During dinner, Fernanda finally managed to express her gratitude in words. She told William how difficult it had been to raise Aurora alone after her husband's death years ago, how every day was a struggle to survive in that unforgiving land. She had nothing to offer as payment, no way to repay him for what he had done for them. William replied abruptly that he did not expect payment, that he had done nothing more than anyone should do. But the way his eyes avoided hers revealed his discomfort with the recognition, with the vulnerability that conversation demanded. Weeks passed, and with them came a subtle but profound transformation. Fernanda, regaining her strength, began to help with the housework, bringing an organization and care that the property had not known in years. Aurora learned to feed the chickens, to fetch water from the well, small tasks that made her feel useful in part of that place. And William, despite himself, began to make room in his rigidly structured life. He found himself explaining to Aurora how to care for the horses, teaching her to recognize the medicinal plants of the desert. He accepted the food Fernanda prepared, without complaining that he had always done things differently. Small concessions that together built something greater. One night, a violent storm hit the region. Strong winds shook the house and rain pounded the roof with wild fury. Aurora, frightened by the thunder, ran not to her mother's room but to William's. She knocked timidly on the door, and when he opened it, he found the girl trembling, not from cold, but from fear. William stood still for a moment, not knowing what to do. Comforting frightened children was not in his repertoire of skills. But then Aurora reached out her small hand to him, and something inside the farmer gave way. He picked her up, carried her to the living room, where the fire was still burning in the fireplace, and sat down with her, keeping her safe while the storm raged outside. Fernanda appeared shortly after, worried about her daughter, but stopped at the doorway when she saw the scene. There was something deeply touching about seeing this huge man, so accustomed to hardship and loneliness, holding a small child with such gentleness. She said nothing, just sat down next to them, and the three of them remained there until the storm passed. That night, something changed forever. No grand, eloquent words were spoken. There were no declarations or promises, but the three of them felt, each in their own way, that they had become more than strangers sharing a roof temporarily. The closest neighbors eventually began to talk. William, the feared hermit, now had a woman and a child living on his farm. Speculation was inevitable, some kind, some less so, but William didn't care about gossip. He had never cared what others thought. Fernanda, however, felt the weight of those conversations. She knew she couldn't impose her presence indefinitely, that she needed to find her own way. One afternoon, she gathered her courage and told William that it was time for them to leave, to find a place of their own, even though she didn't yet know exactly how or where. William's reaction surprised her. He was silent for a long moment, his impassive face revealing nothing of the thoughts that consumed him. Then, in that deep, rough voice, he said something that would change everything. He offered for them to stay, not as charity, but as partners. The farm was large. The work was too hard for one man alone. Fernanda could help around the house and in the garden, which he had never had time to maintain properly. Aurora could grow up there in safety, with space to be a child, and he could once again have something he thought he had lost forever, a reason to come home at the end of the day. Fernanda looked into the eyes of the man who had saved their lives and saw not pity, but respect. He did not see them as a burden, but as something that brought value to his existence. Tears filled her eyes and she accepted, not out of necessity, but by choice, recognizing that this place, against all odds, had become home. Aurora, who had listened to everything hidden behind the door, ran to hug William with a strength disproportionate to her small size. And the farmer, that giant whom the world feared, returned the hug with a kindness that revealed the depth of the transformation that had taken place in his heart. That night, under the starry Arizona sky, three lonely souls found in each other a family that none of them had sought, but that they all desperately needed. The months that followed brought profound changes to the farm in the heart of Arizona. The property that once reflected its owner's loneliness now pulsed with life. The vegetable garden Fernanda cultivated produced robust vegetables that defied the aridity. The flower beds Aurora had insisted on planting brought vibrant colors to the monochromatic landscape. And the house, that large empty structure, had been transformed into something William never imagined he would have again. A true home. William discovered a patience in himself that he didn't know he had. He taught Aurora to ride, holding her steady as she learned to command the animal with growing confidence. He saw in her a spark of determination that reminded him of himself in more innocent times, before life had hardened him. Fernanda, for her part, brought not only order to the house, but also human warmth. Her songs while she worked echoed through the quarters that had previously known only silence. She cooked meals that transformed William's functional eating into moments of shared pleasure, and there was a mutual respect between them that grew silently, built on gratitude, admiration, and something deeper that neither dared to name. Aurora flourished in that environment. The girl who had arrived barefoot and desperate now ran around the property with joy. Her laughter was a sound William didn't know he missed until he heard it every day. She learned to care for animals, to recognize the seasons of the desert, to find beauty in simple things. But the peace of that new arrangement was tested when the men who had attacked Fernanda returned to the region. They were four brutal outsiders who made terror their way of life, taking what they wanted from those who couldn't defend themselves. They had heard about the woman who had survived their attack and now lived on the farm of the feared William. They came on a sweltering afternoon, their intentions clear in the way they rode, in the way they wielded their weapons. They wanted to finish what they had started. And if the farmer tried to interfere, well, 4 against 1 were odds they liked. William saw them coming before they reached the property. His years of solitude had sharpened his instincts, taught him to recognize danger from a distance. He instructed Fernanda and Aurora to lock themselves in the inner room of the house, the safest area, and prepared for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. The strangers stopped their horses in the yard, their arrogance evident in the way they occupied the space, as if it were already theirs. The leader, a tall man with a scar cutting across his face from eye to chin, called out to William in a challenging tone. The farmer emerged from his house, and something in his posture, in the calm but lethal way he moved, made the strangers hesitate for a brief moment. William was not like the easy victims they were used to. There was a contained danger in him, a silent promise of violence that made even brutal men rethink their choices. But there were 4 of them, and greed overcame prudence. The leader demanded that William hand over his wife, saying she had a debt to pay. His cruel laughter echoed across the yard, followed by the laughter of the others. William did not respond with words. He simply stood there motionless, his cold eyes assessing his opponents with the precision of someone who knew the nature of violence intimately. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but laden with a threat that was absolutely real. He said they could try. They might even succeed in killing him if they were quick and lucky. But he promised that at least 2, maybe 3 of them would not leave that property alive. And those who survived would bear marks that would remind them every day for the rest of their lives of the mistake they had made in threatening the people under his protection. There was an absolute certainty in William's statement that was not angry. It was simply a fact stated as naturally as predicting the sunrise. The outsiders saw something in his eyes that they recognized, a total willingness to do anything, to go to any extreme, regardless of the personal cost. The leader, unaccustomed to being challenged, pulled his gun, but William was faster. Not just fast, but precise, efficient, moving with a lethality that came from years of surviving in that brutal land. The ensuing confrontation was swift and decisive. When silence returned to the farm, three of the outsiders were lying on the ground, seriously wounded but alive. The fourth, the leader, was unarmed, on his knees, facing the barrel of his own gun now in William's hands. There was terror in his eyes, the realization that he had seriously underestimated the man in front of him. William could have ended it there, could have eliminated that threat permanently, and few would have blamed him in that land where official justice was rare and distant. Then he heard the door of the house open and turned to see the Dawn standing on the threshold, her wide eyes absorbing the scene of violence. Something changed in William's gaze at that moment. He saw himself through the eyes of that child, saw the man he was becoming again, or perhaps the man he was leaving behind. There was a choice there, a crossroads between what he had always been and what these two women had inspired him to be. He lowered his gun, ordered the outsiders to leave and never return, to spread the word that this property and everyone who lived on it were under his protection, that anyone who threatened them would face consequences far worse than those he had demonstrated that day. The men didn't need to be told twice. They gathered their wounded and left, leaving behind only dust and the certainty that they had found something rare in that desert. A man whose ferocity was matched only by his capacity for mercy when it mattered. Aurora ran to William as soon as the outsiders disappeared over the horizon. She said nothing about the violence she had witnessed, but she hugged him tightly. And in that embrace was an understanding that went beyond her age. She knew that this man had done what he needed to do to protect them, but he had also chosen not to lose himself completely in the darknesses that his previous life demanded. Fernanda emerged from the house pale but steady. She had heard everything, understood what that confrontation meant. William had risked everything, not out of obligation but by choice because they had become important to him in a way he probably still struggled to fully understand. That night, after Aurora had put her to sleep, William and Fernanda sat on the porch, watching the stars that shone with impossible clarity in the desert sky. For the first time, they spoke openly about the future, about what this arrangement they had created meant, about the feelings that were growing between them, despite or perhaps because of their unlikely origins. Fernanda confessed that she had come to love William not only out of gratitude, but out of genuine admiration for the man he had revealed himself to be. A man capable of extreme harshness when necessary, but also of profound kindness when it mattered. A man who had chosen to break down the walls he had built around his heart, allowing himself to be vulnerable again. William, uncomfortable with words of emotion, even after all that time, simply took Fernanda's hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but one laden with meaning. A recognition that she and Aurora had become his family, not by blood or by law, but by something much stronger, by mutual choice, by respect, by love that had grown in unlikely soil. The years that followed brought prosperity to the farm. Word spread about William, no longer just as the fearsome hermit, but as the righteous man who protected his own and helped neighbors in need. Other isolated settlers began to seek him out when they faced problems, knowing that they would find not only strength there, but also wisdom born of experience. Aurora grew up under that vast Arizona sky, becoming a strong and confident young woman. She learned from William to be resilient, to face adversity with courage. She learned from Fernanda to maintain compassion, even in difficult times, to find beauty and create a home wherever she was. And William, the man who had once chosen solitude as protection against pain, discovered something he had never imagined possible. He discovered that opening his heart was risky, yes, but that the love he received in return was worth every moment of vulnerability. That family was not just blood, but choice. That redemption was possible even for those who had lost themselves in the shadows. One afternoon, many years after that first cold dawn, when a desperate girl had knocked on his door, William was working in the field when he saw Aurora, now a young woman, teaching her own little boy to plant seeds in the hard earth. Fernanda, her hair gray but her smile still radiant, watched from afar, proud. William stopped his work and simply watched the scene. He thought about the unlikely journey that had brought them there, how a single moment of compassion had changed not only 3 lives, but generations to come. He thought about how close he had been to turning him back on that frightened child and returning to the cold safety of his solitude. And for the first time in many decades, William truly smiled. Not a bitter or ironic smile, but a genuine one, full of gratitude for having made the right choice on that distant day, for having allowed that tiny girl to crack the armor around his heart and let in the light. Because in the end, William realized, a man's true legacy is not in the land he accumulates or the fear he inspires. It is in the love he sows, in the lives he touches, in the choices he makes when it would be easier to look the other way. And in that moment, under the hot Arizona sun, surrounded by the family that fate had brought him in the most unexpected way, William knew that his life, despite all his mistakes and past pains, had been worth it. The farm would remain there for generations, passed down through the family, which had begun with a simple act of compassion. And whenever storms came, because they always come in the relentless desert, there would be people there who would remember the lesson that William, Fernanda, and Aurora taught just by existing together. That even in the most arid places, love can take root. That even the hardest hearts can soften again. And that sometimes the strongest families are those we choose to build, piece by piece, day after day, in a land that demands everything from us, but that can also give us everything if we have the courage to open our arms and accept it. The sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, the same colors that shone on that cold dawn so many years ago. And William, the giant who once knew only loneliness, walked home to the warmth of his family, the aroma of dinner being prepared, and the laughter of children now echoing through the same hallways that once knew only silence. It was an ending, but it was also the beginning of a legacy of love that would continue long after they were all gone. An eternal testimony that a moment of compassion can change the world forever. 20 years had passed since that cold morning that changed everything. Arizona remained arid and unforgiving, but Williams Farm thrived like an oasis of life in the middle of the desert. The fences were well maintained, the fields cultivated with wisdom, and the house that had once known only loneliness now overflowed with stories, memories, and love. William sat on the porch watching the golden horizon of the sunset. His hair had turned completely white, and the wrinkles around his eyes told stories of smiles he had never imagined giving. Beside him, Fernanda knitted a blanket for the grandson who would soon be born, her nimble fingers working the wool with the same dedication she had always put into everything she did. Aurora, now a 26-year-old woman, was in the field with her husband Thomas, a good man whom William had approved of after rigorous tests disguised as casual conversations. She was a few months pregnant, and the way she protected her rounded belly reminded William of the determined girl who had once run barefoot across the ice to save her mother. Life had been generous to them, but not without challenges. There had been droughts that tested their resilience, storms that destroyed crops, and moments when survival seemed unlikely. But they had always stuck together, facing each obstacle as the family they had chosen to be. On that particular afternoon, something different hung in the air. Williams felt an uneasiness he couldn't name, a sense that cycles were closing, that time was doing its inevitable work of stitching together past and future. Aurora climbed the steps of the porch, one hand supporting her back, and sat down next to the parents who had raised her. Yes, parents, because William had become her father in every way that mattered, much more than biology could define. She looked at the man who had once been the scary giant of the region and was now her safe haven, and asked him something she had been thinking about for days. She asked if he had any regrets, if looking back would change anything about that morning when a desperate child knocked on his door. William was silent for a long moment, his gaze lost in the distant mountains. Fernanda stopped knitting, waiting for the answer she herself was curious to hear. The old farmer finally spoke, and his voice, though hoarse with age, carried an unshakable certainty. He said that for years he had built walls around himself, convinced that loneliness was strength and connection was weakness. He said he had become a ghost of a man, existing but not living, breathing but not feeling. And then dawn arrived, small and broken, but filled with a love so pure that it cracked those walls he thought were impenetrable. She did not ask permission to enter his heart. She simply entered, bringing with her a light he didn't even know he was missing. William turned to Fernanda, took her aged but still warm hand, and said that she had taught him that vulnerability was not weakness, but the greatest courage of all. That allowing himself to love again after all his losses was the most courageous act a man could perform. Tears streamed down Aurora's face as she listened to those words. She knew the story, of course, but hearing it from the perspective of the man she loved like a father brought a new depth, a richer understanding of the sacrifice and transformation he had experienced. Fernanda also cried silently, remembering that broken woman William had saved, that desperate mother who saw in the mercy of a stranger her last hope. She remembered every moment since then, every small victory, every challenge overcome, every night they fell asleep grateful to have each other. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. William instinctively became alert. Old habits never die completely, but he relaxed when he recognized the visitors. It was the Hendersons, a family of neighboring farmers who had become close friends over the years. But they did not come alone. With them was a young woman no more than 20 years old holding a small child. She had the hollow eyes of someone who hadn't slept in days, torn clothes, and that unmistakable look of someone who had fled from something terrible. Sarah Renderson dismounted and quickly explained. They had found the woman on the road, fleeing from a violent husband who had beaten her and threatened to kill her and her son. She had no family, nowhere to go, and was desperate. Sarah remembered the stories about William and Fernanda, about how they had built a family of lost souls, and thought that perhaps they could help or at least advise. William looked at that frightened woman holding her child, and it was like looking through time. He saw Fernanda in that face marked by violence. He saw Dawn in that child clinging to her mother. He saw himself at that crossroads, between turning away or reaching out. But this time there was no hesitation, no internal conflict, no walls to tear down, because they simply no longer existed. William got up, walked over to the frightened woman, and with a kindness that would have been impossible 20 years ago, told her that she was safe now, that this farm was a place where broken people could heal, where families were formed not by blood, but by choice, where there would always be room for one more soul in need of refuge. Fernanda was already moving, preparing a room, heating water, gathering clean clothes. Aurora, even though she was pregnant, helped with the efficiency of someone who had grown up seeing those acts of kindness and learned that this was the right way to exist in the world. The young woman, whose name was Margaret, collapsed in tears of relief. She held her son, a boy of only 3 named Jacob, and whispered thanks that she could barely articulate. That night, William's house once again sheltered lost souls, seeking light in the darkness. The dinner table, which had once served only a lonely man, was now surrounded by William and Fernanda, Aurora and Thomas, the Hendersons who had stayed to make sure Margaret was okay, and Margaret herself with little Jacob. As they shared their meal, William watched the scene with a sense of completeness that transcended words. He thought about how life had a peculiar way of coming full circle, of bringing back situations that allow us to do things differently, to do them better. He thought about how that 6-year-old girl, 20 years ago, had not only saved her mother, but saved him as well. She had saved him from an empty existence, from a petrified heart, from a life that did not deserve to be called life. And now he had the chance to pass on what he had received, to be to Margaret and Jacob what he had chosen to be to Fernanda and Aurora, to prove that the legacy of kindness does not die, but multiplies, touching lives in waves that expand far beyond what we can see. After dinner, when the Rendersons left and Margaret put Jacob to bed in the room she had prepared so carefully, the original family gathered again on the porch. The night was clear. The stars sparkled like diamonds scattered across the black velvet of the ski. Aurora held her belly, feeling her baby move, and understood something profound. Her son would grow up on that farm, learning the same lessons she had learned, about courage, about kindness, about how to open your heart, even when the world teaches you to close it. And one day, perhaps, that child would pass on those lessons, continuing a legacy that had begun with a simple choice on a cold morning. William looked at Aurora, then at Fernanda, and finally at the door where Margaret and Jacob slept safely for the first time in who knows how long. He saw not just 3 people, but future generations who would be touched by those choices, by that refusal to let despair win. Fernanda rested her head on William's shoulder and in a low voice, almost a whisper, said something he would never forget. She said that God had strange ways of healing broken hearts, of turning tragedies into blessings, of using the most unlikely people to do his most important work. And William, the man who once believed in nothing but the cruelty of the world, felt it because he had lived the miracle. He had been transformed from a bitter hermit into a loving patriarch. He had built a family where once there had been only emptiness. He had learned that true power lies not in brute force or absolute independence, but in the ability to love and be loved. The weeks that followed brought changes for Margaret. Under Fernanda's care and William's protection, she began to heal, not only physically but emotionally. Aurora had become her friend and confidant, sharing her own stories of overcoming adversity, building bridges of empathy and understanding. Jacob, the little boy who had arrived frightened and silent, began to play in the fields, his laughter echoing across the farm. William, with the patience he had developed over the years, taught him little things, like feeding the chickens, recognizing plants, and respecting animals. And in all of this, there was an echo of those first days with Aurora. History was repeating itself, but better this time, because William knew exactly what to do. There was no hesitation, no fear of connecting, just the certainty that he was doing what he was born to do. One afternoon, while Margaret was helping Fernanda in the kitchen, she asked why they did that. Why did they take strangers into their home? Why did they care? Why did they risk so much for people they didn't know? Fernanda smiled, that wise smile of someone who had lived long enough to understand the profound truths of life. She told a story, not just the facts, but the feelings, the transformations, the small miracles that happened when people chose love over fear. And as she told it, Margaret cried because she finally understood that she had found not just a temporary refuge, but a true home, that those people saw in her not a burden, but an opportunity to live their values, to honor the second chance that life had given them. Months passed and Aurora's son was born, a strong and healthy boy who was named William in honor of his grandfather, who was not his grandfather by blood, but by something much stronger. On the day of his birth, as he held his grandson in his arms for the first time, old William cried tears that washed away decades of pent-up pain. Margaret was there helping, part of the family that had welcomed her. Jacob played in the corner, happy and safe in a way his mother had never thought possible. And altogether, that unlikely but deeply real family celebrated not only a birth, but the continuation of a legacy of love and redemption. Late that night, William went out onto the porch alone. He looked up at the stars, at the land he had worked for so many years, at the house that had ceased to be just a structure and had become a home in the truest sense of the word. He thought about the journey from a broken and lonely man to a patriarch of a loving family. He thought about all the choices that had brought him there, especially that first choice 20 years ago, when a 6-year-old girl cracked his heart of stone. And William realized something fundamental. It wasn't him and Fernanda who saved Aurora on that cold morning. It was Aurora who saved them. She saved them from the empty life they were living, from the cold fate that awaited them. That desperate child was, in fact, an angel in disguise, bringing the message that it is never too late to choose differently, to love again, to build something beautiful from the ruins. The circle was complete. The hermit had become a father. The heart of stone had become a source of love. The lonely farm had become a sanctuary for lost souls. And all because one day a man chose not to turn his back on a child's despair. William smiled at the stars, feeling a deep peace that only comes when we know we have lived well, that we matter, that we have made a difference. He had found his purpose in that unforgiving desert. It was not to accumulate land or build an empire, but to cultivate love and plant hope in hearts that thought such things no longer existed. As night embraced the farm in its starry mantle, William returned inside to Fernanda's arms, to the warmth of the family they had built together, because he had finally understood the most important lesson of all. Home is not a place, but the people we choose to love and who choose to love us back, creating in the process something eternal, something that survives time, hardship, and even death. The legacy would continue through Aurora and her son William, through Margaret and Jacob, through all the lives that family would touch in the decades to come. A legacy built not on material achievements, but on the simple and repeated choice to reach out rather than close off, to open one's heart rather than protect it, to build bridges rather than walls. And so, under the vast Arizona sky, the story that began with despair ended with hope, proving that even in the most arid places and the most difficult circumstances, love always finds a way to flourish.